1 to 3. And it says, "Now they left Elim and journeyed on into the Shin wilderness between Elim and Mount Sinai, arriving there on the 15th day of the 2nd month after leaving Egypt. There, too, the people spoke bitterly against Moses and Aaron. 'Oh, that we were back in Egypt,' they moaned, 'and that the Lord had killed us there. For there we had plenty to eat. But now you have brought us into this wilderness to kill us with starvation.'" You know, it was an 11-day journey from Horeb by way of Mount Sur to Kadesh. And they would have been there within 2 weeks, even if they had moved slow to accommodate for the women and the children that were along. Yet this journey took the Israelite people 40 years instead. This was how long the descendants of Abraham wandered in the desert. God had warned Abraham of this dark and dreary time in the future when his descendants would be enslaved in a foreign land. Now it had come to pass. Abraham's great-grandson Joseph had been taken to Egypt by slave traders, sold to a traveling caravan by his jealous brothers. They had then told their father that Joseph had been attacked and killed by wild animals, leaving their father to live in torment over the images of what he imagined his son must have gone through in the last hours of his life. But the story was lies, all lies. Their brother had still been alive. At least he had been alive when they had sold him into slavery. You know, Joseph had seen God's hand upon his life during his time in Egypt. Despite the false accusations that had led him to spending time in prison. Eventually, though, he had been released because he was able to interpret a dream that Pharaoh had been having. The dream had foretold of a 7-year famine. But Joseph, after interpreting the dream, was placed as overseer to the storehouses, and Egypt would survive throughout this famine. The famine, though, before that, would reach Joseph's family in Canaan. And so Joseph's brothers had traveled to Egypt to buy food. They were reunited and forgiven by Joseph for the evil that they had done towards him. And afterwards, Joseph had begged these brothers to return home and to gather the rest of their family and to return to Egypt to live with him. And so that's what they had done. All of Joseph's family, his father, Jacob, his brothers' wives and children, all of their flocks, had made the trip from Canaan to Egypt to join Joseph. You know, it's hard to believe that it had now been nearly 400 years ago. And God had indeed blessed this family, and they had grown into a great nation over these hundreds of years. And slowly over the years, though they had been forced into slavery by the Egyptians, forced into back-breaking work as builders. They had even toiled long hours mixing mud and straw together to make the bricks that they would need to build with. The Egyptian overseers were always close by with whips and sticks to beat these Hebrew people with. If their work was not fast enough, or if they were not up to the overseer's standard, the God of their ancestors, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, had seemed very far away, maybe even non-existent, for their cries always seemed to go unanswered. Until one day, a man named Moses and his brother Aaron showed up in Egypt with a promise from God that they had indeed been remembered and that cries had been heard. And God would release them from their struggles and take them back to Canaan, this promised land, a land flowing with milk and honey. Now, Moses and Aaron had sought their release from Pharaoh through plagues and mystical signs and wonders that God had done, but nothing seemed to soften the heart of Pharaoh. Finally, during what would be the first Passover celebration, God brought death to the firstborn of all the Egyptian families, as well as the firstborn of all their herds and their flocks. The firstborn of the Hebrews, however, had remained alive and well due to the presence of lamb's blood that they had been instructed to put upon their doors. Finally, Pharaoh wanted them gone. The death of his own firstborn son by this unknown God had been too much. However, later changing his mind again, Pharaoh and his army had pursued the fleeing Hebrews, but had all drowned in the Red Sea. They had watched as the sea parted and the Hebrew people had crossed by on dry ground, but then as they had attempted to do the same, these walls of water had closed in on each of them. Now this great multitude of people had reached the desert land on the other side of the Red Sea. They were still following this man Moses and his brother, and they were in turn saying that they were following Yahweh, the God of their ancestors. Soon they too were able to see that Moses had been telling the truth, for a large cloud formation had appeared as they traveled, leading them by day. At night, this pillar of cloud became a large column or pillar of fire that could be seen for miles. Depending on whether it was day or night, when the cloud or the fire stopped, the people stopped. And when it moved, then the people got up and they followed, because this was God. However, this honeymoon relationship of gratitude and relief at being released from the stronghold of slavery to the Egyptians soon began to wear off. Almost immediately, the people began to complain. They wanted water, and they wanted food, and they grumbled and accused Moses of bringing them into the desert just to die of thirst and hunger. They didn't trust that their God was the same God that Abraham had named Jehovah-Jireh, the God who provides. When God had provided a ram to replace Abraham's son Isaac on the altar as a sacrifice. The people had been in the wilderness of Shur for 3 days without water. "Must we die of thirst?" they cried. Finally, they came to an area of water, but the water was bitter. God had Moses throw a special tree into the water that changed the taste then from bitter to sweet. And they saw that once again God had provided for his people. And as they traveled further into the wilderness, the people again complained. "Oh, that we were back in Egypt and the Lord had killed us there. After all, we had plenty to eat, but now you have brought us into the wilderness to starve us to kill us with starvation." God then provided angel food for the people. Each morning they would find small white flakes on the ground like bread. The people were to trust God that each day there would be more. But some didn't trust God, and they would gather extra for the next day, only to find it rancid and wormy in the morning. Only on the 6th day could they gather extra of this manna so that they would have for the Sabbath day. And then they found that it was okay, because once again, God had provided. Manna, though, was not enough for these people. Never satisfied, God soon heard the people again complaining to Moses. "Oh, for a few bites of meat. Oh, that we had some of the delicious fish that we enjoyed so much in Egypt, and the wonderful cucumbers and onions, leeks, onions and garlic. But now our strength is gone, and day after day all we have to face is this manna." Now, there were about 600,000 men, not counting the women and children, but God said, "Tell the people that I will provide meat." God then sent quail into the camp, and the people were able to catch and kill the quail. But the Lord was angry and sent a plague throughout the camp that killed many of the people who had lusted after meat and of their old life in Egypt. These incidents that I mentioned were just a small sampling of life for the Israelites in the desert wilderness. For 40 years they lived their life not trusting God, even though they had witnessed his awesome power with Pharaoh, and they had seen how he had provided for their needs by providing food and water. For 40 years, their shoes did not wear out and their clothes did not wear out. But unfortunately, we see that their faith and their trust in God wore out, almost from the very beginning. They were stuck in this wilderness life, this in-between place that God had put them so that they could learn to trust God for all of their needs, and so they could witness God's faithfulness. But instead, they only began to have a wilderness mentality. They spent their days and their nights dreaming of a life that they no longer had. They wished for the rich food and the flesh pots that they enjoyed in Egypt. They wished for the past and for the familiar. Yes, that life had been difficult as slaves, but it had been familiar. It was all that they had known, and they often blamed God that they no longer had it. But God had brought them out of Egypt, out of that land, to give them something better. See, God had big plans for these people if they would only trust Him. Trust that God had their best interests at heart. Trust that God was not leading them to destruction, but to prosperity. Yes, they had to cross through the desert, but that's not where God was leaving them. He was leading them to the promised land, to the land of milk and honey, to the land where they would harvest crops that they had not had to plant, and where they would live in towns and homes that they had not had to sweat and toil to build. But they were afraid to go. They were afraid to trust God. They doubted there was such a place, and they doubted that it was as good as God said. And they doubted that God could lead them there. 40 years of doubt and fears is a long time. 40 years of wondering whether God's promises would prove true or not was a long time. They were stuck in the wilderness. They couldn't go back to their old life. It was gone. They could trust God for their new life, but they were afraid. Yes, their new life would look different and feel different and sound different. There would be strangers there that they would have to get to know, and there was things that they maybe had never done before. Maybe it wouldn't be as good as their old life, but then again, maybe it would be better. In life, we have a lot of wilderness moments, times when we find ourselves in that in-between land, in that desert place. We find ourselves wishing for a past that we no longer have and afraid of a future that is ahead. As a congregation, you have found yourselves there. But as individuals, we often find ourselves there also. After a painful divorce, after the loss of a spouse or a loved one, after we are diagnosed with a medical condition that changes our life as we knew it, we long for what was, and we're afraid of what's ahead. And so we become stuck in this desert wilderness. Maybe only for a short while until we find our way through it. Maybe for years as we wander aimlessly, doubting God's future for us and complaining about what we no longer have. An 11-day journey took 40 years. It took the Israelites 40 years to learn to trust God, but they were never able to fully let go of the memories and the desires of what had been. They died never seeing the great things that God had wanted to give them. Instead, a future generation reaped the rewards. A generation that had trusted God and therefore entered into the promised land. If only the others would have trusted and believed in God's faithfulness. Where are we today? Are we trusting God for our future? Are we willing to put a finished past behind us and move forward, to follow God as He leads us into our new future and the promised land that is waiting for us? God is on the move, and if we aren't willing to follow, we may die in the wilderness as others reap the rewards that are meant for us. Are we ready to move forward knowing that we are following Jehovah Jireh, The God that provides our future and our promised land is waiting. Amen. Let us pray.